You can almost feel the instant regret of this particular Fox News host as she loses control of her MAGA talking point fueled interview with a Democratic senator named Mark Kelly. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we got a couple of clips to play here. Fox News is actually, in some ways, bear with me, more complicated than I think we often say. It is a propaganda network. It is the most dishonest news network in mainstream media. And yes, it is a part of mainstream media. They're the biggest, most successful news network in the country. They are not the outlier. They are not the renegade, the rogue. They are, by definition, the cornerstone of legacy media. And even though they paid $787 million in a defamation settlement to Dominion Voting Systems, which is a settlement that we've never seen before from MSNBC, from CNN, that they had to pay nearly $1 billion for their lies, particularly about the 2020 election, they are so dishonest. And yet, they're kind of cunning, right? In the sense that they also employ the likes of Neil Cavuto, Jessica Tarlov, someone we're a big fan of on the show, and Shannon Bream. Shannon Bream took over from Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday, and she's supposed to be one of the straight news journalists, and Fox News Sunday is supposed to be one of the straight news programs. Well, that tends to go away as we get closer to the election, and so she dumped a lot of MAGA talking points into this interview and really tried to push them. But Democratic Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona wasn't having any of it, and he shut her down in real time.
And if you live here in Arizona, and this is really important, Shannon, Donald Trump last week said he was going to kill the CHIPS Act, which is bringing all these semiconductor manufacturing jobs. And just this week, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, confirmed that if Donald Trump is president, they're going to end this program. Well, we're talking about tens of thousands of good-paying jobs.
The Speaker has made some clarification on that and said he misspoke or misheard a question when he was asked about the CHIPS Act, and there is no plan in the House or for the
Shannon,
Speaker to get rid of that.
I went back and listened multiple times to what he said and the question. It's very clear to me that he didn't misunderstand what was said there. He actually repeated part of the question in the answer and said that if Donald Trump is president, they're going to end this program, which is probably the biggest foreign investment in our country. We're talking about, from TSMC, $65 billion in the state of Arizona alone. Overall, the investment in Arizona is $100 billion from private companies.
Okay. His clarification was that they're not going to kill chips. I think that his follow-up was that they would like to better the program, that they would like to embolden and bolster it, from his explanation. But again, that's coming from him. You heard it one way. He says he didn't hear the question.
Yeah, but when you consider that and what he said and you combine it with what Donald Trump said, Donald Trump made it perfectly clear that program is dead if he is president again.
Okay,
I was with some iron workers just the other day, and these folks are going to lose their jobs if Donald Trump is president. And that's why I think we're seeing really high turnout here.
So again, Mark Kelly, not the best rhetorician in the country by any respect. He's not Pete Buttigieg, but he's very sharp. He's very concise. He's no nonsense. And I love that he pushed back on this, right? And what's interesting is how much Shannon Bream was so eager to pursue this. Well, he clarified. Well, no, Shannon. And again, Mark Kelly's like, I heard Mike Johnson repeat the question in his answer. He clearly heard the question and he answered. You just don't like the answer that he gave. And so you're relentlessly pushing the so-called clarification. And in the context of this, I find it so funny because, again, the game you should always play is what if the shoe were on the other foot? So what if it had been a Democrat who said something politically inconvenient and then you tried to clarify after the fact? Would Fox News be so relentless in its pursuit of the so-called clarification? Would they interrupt their Republican interviewees and say, no, the Democrat clarified. No, the Democrat clarified. Would it even be mentioned at all? We can assume not, right? Shannon Bream is desperate to cover Mike Johnson and Donald Trump's ass, even though, again, even if we were to give Johnson the benefit of the doubt, which we don't have to because the evidence is against him, Donald Trump, Mike Johnson's cult leader, has made it abundantly clear he wants to undo all of President Biden and Vice President Harris's legislation, including the wildly successful CHIPS Act, and also to go back and take shots at President Obama's legislative agenda as well, like the Affordable Care Act. So it doesn't pass the smell test. And Shannon Bream, you can hear her stammering. No, he wants to bolster to embolden. No, Shannon, He said what he said. You would never accept this under any other circumstances for a Democrat, and we're just going to hold you to the same standard you hold Democrats to, and you always lose when that happens because Republicans can't possibly win when they're held to the same standard. And she knows that and is desperate to stack the deck in the Republicans' favor. Also point out the CHIPS and Science Act is responsible for a manufacturing boom in this country, which is also benefiting red states, not just blue states, red states. And the semiconductor manufacturing that's going on in this country, that's the company that Mark Kelly referred to, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. It's the most important manufacturer of semiconductors in the world. And semiconductors are vital for our technology, medical, automobile, military, it doesn't matter. And that's why President Biden correctly tried to encourage investment here in the United States, unlike anything we ever saw under Donald Trump, I might add, not only because it's economically beneficial, but also it's a national security concern. And Donald Trump wants to make us more vulnerable by simply just reflexively gutting this brilliant piece of Democratic-led agenda. I digress. Another clip.
But this very basic thing about how a tariff works, he just doesn't seem to understand it.
Well, people do have 4 years of President Trump. They know what the economy was like then. They know what their personal situation was like. They do, in assessing that against the last 4 years, feel better about how they were doing under President Trump. Unemployment hit new lows. We had to get through a pandemic, clearly, but poverty was down, home ownership was up. And prior to
Shannon,
the pandemic hitting, people felt good about where they were.
Shannon, unemployment is at a historically low level right now. I understand that people they're struggling with costs because of inflation, but inflation is also now down to 2.5%. And I'll come back to, Donald Trump's economy. He botched the handling of this pandemic. A lot of Americans lost their lives unnecessarily.
The numbers will show that more than half the jobs lost by the pandemic, by the time he left a year into it, they were back. The economy was running again to the assessment of most Americans that they felt hopeful.
All of those jobs were back under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. We're back down to historic unemployment. Donald Trump lost 200,000 manufacturing jobs. This wasn't because of the pandemic. This was because of his policies to overseas, to foreign countries. 200,000 good-paying jobs. When Joe Biden and Kamala Harris got into the White House, they worked with the United States Senate and the House in a bipartisan way to come up with programs like the CHIPS Act, bringing these manufacturing jobs back to the country. This was bipartisan legislation, by the way. This is the way that the government is supposed to work to benefit the American people. Donald Trump's entire presidency and now his campaign has been one about grievance. He talks about the enemies from within. Those enemies are people in the United States Senate, in Congress, that he wants to specifically go after. He's not a guy that's going to bring us together and solve these problems for the American people in a bipartisan way.
Okay,
Kamala Harris is committed to being a president for all of America.
Okay, so
not
let's
just
talk
for
about
the people
that
who
a
vote
little
for
bit,
her.
because...
So I think the next clip, deals with that. But again, I just want to say Mark Kelly's doing a really good job here. Again, Shannon Bream is so desperate for people to grade Trump on a curve. Well, Trump did mismanage the pandemic. And he also inherited a really good economy from Barack Obama. So he inherited something good, continued Obama era economic trends, and then the economy tanked in his fourth year in office. They don't want you to count it. They absolutely would count it if it had been a Democrat in charge. So again, the double standard is thick here, and we're not obligated to indulge it. No, we say pick a standard. And if you're going to apply a certain standard to Democrats, we're going to enforce it for Republicans too. Trump loses. President Biden inherited a disastrous economy from former President Trump, and then masterfully created a soft landing, 16 million jobs created on Biden and Harris's watch. Even if you control for the pandemic, more jobs created per month under Joe Biden than Donald Trump. Unemployment was lower under Joe Biden than it ever was under Donald Trump. There's more manufacturing jobs created on Joe Biden's watch than Donald Trump's. It goes on and on and on. But Fox wants you to believe that the economy is in tatters for whatever reason. Well, actually, we know what the reason is, which is that they're biased towards Trump and they want him to win the election. One last clip in the sparring match between Shannon Bream and Mark Kelly.
About that a little bit, because there's been a lot of language in the closing argument by the vice president that has referred to him as fascist, has talked about threat to democracy, existential threat, bad for the country, divisive, all of those things. So with that in mind, should he win the presidency, you're a member of Congress that will have something to say about that as the electoral votes come in. Would you, as a member of Congress, certify the votes for him should he win on Tuesday or whenever this election is decided?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think the vice president would certify as well?
Yes, of course she would. I mean, and Republicans, some of them in the Senate, you know, we understand the importance of the functioning of our government and the peaceful transfer of power. Donald Trump doesn't. He seems to already be trying to set up the conditions where he could do what he did in 2020, do it all over again.
But he did leave in 2020.
But you're not going to. After he sent a mob to Capitol Hill, I was in the Senate chamber that day. There are people that died that day because Donald Trump refused to accept the election. If it turns out that he wins this election, you're not going to see the same thing from myself and my colleagues, including the vice president. I mean, she understands that the importance of in a democracy that you have to peacefully turn over power. And I will do my best if he was.
So, again, what's so interesting about that is, again, the presumption that Democrats are just like Republicans. Well, there is no evidence of that. Now, could that change? I suppose. But there's no evidence of it now. I'm sorry. Based on the evidence, the GOP, their elected officials, are just morally inferior to Democratic elected officials. They're more authoritarian. They're less democratic. They're much more self-interested than Democratic politicians. Republicans have a unique problem with democracy. Well, Democrats have objected to Republican victories before. They never formally objected, number one. Number two, they never sent a riotous mob to, kill Republican politicians. They didn't conspire to sue their way into the White House the way Trump did. They didn't attempt to send fake electors and engage in conspiracies to defraud millions of Americans. This is a false equivalence. Republicans are objectively worse. And this idea, well, he left office eventually. Again, we could just be that reductive about any conflict in history. Well, Germany eventually surrendered in World War II, so no harm, no foul. The Confederacy, they eventually surrendered in the Civil War, right? No harm, no foul. No, I'm sorry, your actions matter. And the peaceful transfer of power is at the bare minimum a 4-step process. There's the election. There's the electors themselves casting their ballots. There's on January 6th, the certification of the Electoral College outcome. And then January 20th is when the new administration is inaugurated. And if you interrupt any of that 4-part process with violence, by definition, you have disrupted the peaceful transfer of power. Democrats have never done that. Republicans have they're the only party that's done that. And so any suggestion to the contrary is just a false equivalence. And Shannon Bream is just so eager to downplay it in order to suggest that Trump isn't that far apart from Kamala Harris. No. He is intellectually and morally inferior to her. He is an authoritarian, malignant narcissist. He is a fascist, according to many of his own ex-generals and ex-staff members who know him far better than Shannon Bream or anybody at Fox ever will. And so, yeah, the evidence is pretty clear. And if Trump doesn't like it, then Trump should stop behaving and acting like a fascist. And maybe Fox should encourage him to do that as well. Food for thought. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.